of a second question, which is, well, I should say in my free time, I like to do some cooking, and always the first thing I look at when I turn to a new recipe is the list of ingredients. And so what I'm wondering is, what are the ingredients that you see as being necessary in this sort of comprehensive legislation dealing with pandemic response on the national level? And also, can you give us some examples of different countries that have enacted legislation, in response to the pandemic?
Thanks, Warren. This is an interesting question, because over the past 1 year, we have seen several kinds of legislations that countries have relied upon during this pandemic response. I like to list out the key ingredients in any legal response to a pandemic in 3 categories. The first one are the public health regulatory components. The second is the checks and the balances, and I've already explained the reasons of why we need both these elements. And the third one is privacy concern, and I'll explain you later why I have categorized this quite separately. As far as the public health regulatory components are concerned, there's some basic essential components that by now I'm sure all of us have heard of. These include lockdowns, curfews, regulating individual movements, mask mandates, border restrictions, both international as well as domestic borders, quarantine and isolation measures, surveillance, including contact tracing. Now, the laws, to the extent possible, should provide for these components, which are required in response to a pandemic. And they must also clearly mention the penalties for the violation of these offenses. But as I mentioned at the very start, not everything can and should be governed by law, particularly during emergencies. A degree of flexibility is required to take spontaneous actions, and for that, we should avoid over-regulation. Another component is that national laws and emergency plans must take into account international obligations, which includes our International Health Regulation, IHR, which is a legally binding WHO regulation. Next, public health agency laws should clearly define legal authority and the roles of key officials during an emergency. Overlapping authority and gaps in authority may cause uncertainty, disputes, lack of coordination between different levels and departments of governments at the time of the pandemic response. Hence, a public health law should clearly delineate the powers and functions of different ministries, as well as the statutory and executive bodies. Then public health law should establish clear triggers for the application of emergency powers. They should define and categorize public health emergencies, as well as set clear time limits for the application of these emergency powers. This is so important even in the present day context. So just ask yourself, what is the threshold to resume normal life and renew civil liberties? Who decides this and when? There's a legitimate risk that in this pandemic, many governments would avoid the question of what level of virus prevalence would be anticipated for returning to normality in the likely scenario COVID-19 was never fully eliminated. Hence the importance that the law should mention clear triggers and the clear time limit of the emergency powers. Then, to increase the health workforce during an emergency, public health laws may grant temporary practice licenses to health professionals who are inactive, retired, or licensed in other jurisdictions. Laws may also authorize government authorities to take control of premises, facilities and supplies, including health facilities, medical supplies, and provided that reasonable compensation is paid. And finally, laws should also authorize public health officials to purchase and acquire essential medicines, vaccines, and other medical supplies from public or private sources on reasonable terms. Next, moving on to the checks and balances, which every public health emergency law should reflect. So, laws should have clear provisions to ensure that health powers are exercised in a transparent and non-discriminatory manner, with full respect for the dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms of persons, and should not be arbitrary. Emergency laws that place limitations on individual freedoms during a public health emergency must, first, they should respond to a pressing public health or a social need. They should pursue a specified and legitimate aim. They should be proportional to the legitimate aim. And finally, they should not be any more restrictive than required to achieve the purpose sought by restricting the right. Now, this means that the measures adopted during an emergency must be least invasive and intrusive to civil liberties. For instance, in case of restricting international travels, only those health measures be adopted that are neither more restrictive of international traffic and nor more intrusive to persons than reasonable and appropriate international measures. Now, many of you lawmakers and policymakers, right in the beginning of last year, that's March, must have read that many of the international travel restrictions violated Article 43 of the IHR. This is exactly what I'm talking about here. So in a sense, there are two important tools to ensure that these checks and balances find place in a public health emergency law. The first is that laws should include accountability mechanisms, such as the right to seek review of decisions that affect a person's fundamental rights by an independent external body within a time frame that is reasonable in the circumstances. It is important to keep in mind that often during a pandemic, national courts may become inoperational for some time, and that even happened in India. Another tool to ensure transparency is to have a mandatory requirement in law for the executive to pass written orders and publish them in public. And this will ensure that they can be challenged in court, because at the end of the day, transparency is often conceived as the principal safeguard for accountability. Moving on to my third category of the ingredients, which are the privacy concerns. And so this pandemic has witnessed excessive use of technology for public health surveillance in the form of contact tracing. While this is definitely going the right direction, it raises numerous privacy concerns that must be addressed in laws. Certain principles that every data privacy law, as well as laws governing public health surveillance, must respect include purpose limitation, which basically means that a reasonable nexus should exist between the object sought to be achieved and the means to achieve them. Then storage limitation, that implies that time-bound retention and proper destruction or deletion of data should be done once the purpose has been met. Then data minimization, which reflects that minimal amount of data should be collected and only what is necessary to achieve the limited objective. And finally, transparency and accountability measures, which includes having full public disclosures and having an independent regulatory authority that oversees every executive action. So some important privacy legislative examples are, and one of my almost favorite, comes from Europe, and that's the EU GDPR, which is the overarching privacy law in EU. It acts as a guiding star on this issue. Back in March last year, the regulatory authority had issued clear guidelines for countries to respect privacy rights while engaging in contact tracing through technology. We have other decent privacy law examples coming from California and South Korea. As far as India is concerned, it's unfortunate we are struggling to pass a data protection law for the past 2 years, and it's only a need of the hour. So just to reflect on some important legislations and examples of legislation as far as the pandemic response is concerned, I'll first talk about India quickly and then come to Thailand. So in India, the laws that were employed in the ongoing crisis are the Epidemic Diseases Act of 1897 and the Disaster Management Act of 2005. Unfortunately, neither of these constitute an effective legal framework for public health emergency preparedness and response in India. The Epidemic Diseases Act, which is a century-old colonial legislation, comprises of just 4 sections and doesn't even define epidemic or communicable diseases. In fact, there are no definitions in the laws at all, and it fails to lay down clear roles and duties of authorities. It is also clear from the scheme of the Disaster Management Act that it contemplates natural and man-made disasters and does not deal with outbreaks or public health emergencies. So hence the use of such ad hoc legal architecture in India with a multiplicity of statutes has resulted in a patchwork response against the epidemics. Looking at Thailand, they have a Communicable Diseases Act of 2015, which is a pretty decent legislation. They have clear definitions. They have categories for communicable diseases based on severity. They lay down roles and functions of different authorities during a pandemic. In fact, they even have a provision for maintaining confidentiality and for processing data on an anonymous basis. Provisions for quarantine and isolation, as well as disease surveillance and restricting individuals, also find place in Thailand. I'm not saying they have the best legislation, but it's a good and decent law. Other interesting examples comes from Indonesia, which has a 3-fold legal response to the pandemic, which in the form of the Law on Infectious Diseases 1984, the Law on Disaster Management 2007, Law on Home Quarantine 2018. South Korea also has 2 decent laws. One is the Infectious Disease Control and Prevention Act, and the other is the Quarantine Act 2009. So for those of you who are interested to dig into different kinds of legislations countries across the world have relied on during the pandemic, I would highly recommend to look at the COVID-19 Law Lab, which is an open access tool developed by WHO, the O'Neill Institute for National Global Health Law, UNDP, and other partners. The lab covers laws and policies across the world, categorized into 7 responses. I'll be glad to share the link in the chat box for our audience. And finally, another key ingredient in any legal response to a pandemic should be having the right decision makers. There is such a greater need to have global health and public health lawyers at the forefront. We need to lay down the groundwork for cross-disciplinary brainstorming to resolve such complex issues. Thanks, Warren.
Thank you, Kashish. That was a really fantastic, impressive checklist for the sorts of things a country needs written into its law in order to effectively address a public health emergency. I know that sometimes you will find those elements in, say, a model law, but of course, as you point out, countries are not starting from scratch here. Like you mentioned, for India, we have laws going all the way back into the 1800s. You start with a legal framework. And so I can see how in that context, going through a checklist can be extremely useful for purposes of building upon the laws that you have in place and those which you need in place.